The scorching summer sun hung low over the Montana prairie as Elijah Winters spotted the motionless figure sprawled across the dusty trail. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, lay torn and soiled against the parched earth of 1875. The woman's face burned an alarming red against her otherwise pale skin, and when Elijah pressed his calloused hand to her forehead, the heat radiating from her sent a chill down his spine despite the sweltering afternoon. "Miss, can you hear me?" Elijah called, gently shaking her shoulder. The woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing hazel eyes clouded with fever before they rolled back in her head. Her cracked lips parted, but only a raspy breath escaped. Elijah glanced around at the empty landscape stretching for miles in every direction. The nearest town, Spokane Falls, was still a good day's ride north, and his own homestead lay 3 hours south. The decision was simple: he couldn't leave her to die under the merciless sun. "Don't you worry now," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "I'll get you somewhere safe." With careful movements, he gathered the stranger into his arms, noting how light she felt despite her tall frame. Her head lolled against his chest as he secured her atop his horse, then mounted behind her, one arm holding her steady against him. "Easy, Thunder," he soothed his stallion. "We've got precious cargo now." The woman stirred briefly, mumbling incoherent words as her burning cheek pressed against his shoulder. Elijah urged Thunder into a steady trot, mindful not to jostle his unexpected charge too much. As they rode, he studied what little he could see of her face. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with auburn hair that might have been neatly pinned that morning but now hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her clothes, though trail-worn, were of good quality, not a settler's homespun garments, but not the fancy attire of a city lady either. A small leather satchel had been lying near her on the trail, which Elijah had secured to his saddle. Other than that, there had been no sign of luggage, no horse, nothing to indicate how she'd come to be alone and unconscious in the middle of nowhere. "What's your story?" he asked softly, though all he received in response was the shallow rise and fall of her chest against his arm. The sun was beginning its descent when Elijah's modest homestead finally came into view. The one-story cabin wasn't much a main room with a stone hearth, a separate bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen addition he'd built last autumn. But it was solid, clean, and, most importantly right now, cool compared to the blistering heat outside. After dismounting and lifting the woman from the saddle, Elijah shouldered open the door and carried her straight to his bed. She hadn't regained consciousness during the journey, but her breathing remained steady, which he took as a good sign. "Let's get you comfortable," he murmured, gently removing her dust-covered boots and loosening the collar of her dress. He hesitated, knowing she needed cooler clothes but unwilling to cross that line with an unconscious stranger. Instead, he fetched his cleanest shirt and a basin of water. With careful movements, he dampened a cloth and began wiping the dust from her face, neck, and arms. Her skin burned beneath his touch, and he frowned at the heat radiating from her. When he'd done what he could without impropriety, he covered her with his lightest sheet and placed the damp cloth across her forehead. "I'll be right back," he promised, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Outside at the well, Elijah drew fresh water, mentally cataloging what remedies he had for fever. His mother had been skilled with herbs, and though Elijah was no healer, he'd picked up enough to get by in the 5 years since settling this land. Willow bark tea would help bring down the fever. He also had dried yarrow and elderflower, good for sweating out sickness. Night was falling by the time Elijah had prepared the tea and a simple broth. He returned to the bedroom, where the woman remained unconscious, her breathing more labored than before. The cloth on her forehead had already grown warm. "Miss," he gently shook her shoulder, "I need you to wake up and drink something." To his surprise, her eyelids fluttered open, those hazel eyes, though glazed with fever, fixed on his face with a moment of startled clarity. "Where?" Her voice emerged as a dry rasp. "You're safe," Elijah assured her, helping her sit up enough to sip the tea. "I found you on the trail about 3 hours south of here. You have a bad fever." She managed 2 small sips before turning her head away. "Grace," she whispered. "My name is Grace." "Grace," Elijah repeated. "I'm Elijah Winters. You can call me Illy." "Illy," she murmured, already drifting back into unconsciousness. "Thank you." Throughout that night, Elijah kept vigil beside the bed, regularly replacing the cool cloth on Grace's forehead and trying to get her to drink whenever she stirred. By midnight, her fever had risen higher, and she began to thrash and mumble in her delirium. "The stagecoach," she gasped once, her fingers clutching at the sheets. "They took everything." "Who did, Grace?" Elijah asked, but she had already slipped back into troubled unconsciousness. As dawn approached, Elijah realized her fever was dangerously high. He'd used every remedy he knew, but she wasn't improving. If anything, she was getting worse. Her skin had taken on a frightening pallor beneath the fever's flush, and her breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. "I won't let you die," he promised, taking her hot hand between his cool ones. "I will care for you until you're well again." The words seemed to reach her somehow. Her fingers tightened around his, and her restless movements calmed slightly. Elijah continued talking, his voice low and steady in the dimness of early morning. "I don't know your story yet, Grace, but I reckon you're a fighter. You've made it this far, just keep fighting a little longer." When the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's small window, Elijah made a decision. He couldn't treat this fever alone. He needed help, which meant riding to the nearest neighbor, the Hendersons, whose homestead lay about an hour west. "Grace," he said, leaning closer to her flushed face, "I need to fetch help. I'll be gone about 3 hours. I've left water right here." He placed a cup on the small table beside the bed. "I'll be back as quick as I can." Whether she understood or not, he couldn't tell. Gathering his hat and gun belt, Elijah took one last look at the woman in his bed before heading out to saddle Thunder. The ride to the Hendersons' homestead had never seemed so long. Elijah pushed Thunder harder than usual, arriving at the modest cabin just as Martha Henderson was hanging laundry in the yard. "Illy," she called in surprise. "What brings you by so early?" Quickly, Elijah explained the situation. Martha Henderson, a stout woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes, listened with growing concern. "Of course I'll come," she said when he'd finished. "Let me gather my things and tell Robert where I'm going." 20 minutes later, they were riding back to Elijah's homestead, Martha on her sturdy mare with her medicine bag secured behind the saddle. Despite her age, Martha kept pace with Elijah's urgency, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Found her just lying there on the trail," Martha asked as they rode. "Poor thing. Robbery, you think?" "That's my guess," Elijah replied. "She mentioned a stagecoach and they took everything during her delirium." Martha nodded grimly. "The Spokane, Montana line has had trouble with bandits this past month. Sheriff Tanner mentioned it when we were in town last week. 2 coaches robbed, passengers left stranded." "She's lucky to be alive then," Elijah said, a fresh wave of concern washing over him. If bandits had attacked Grace's stagecoach, they might have done worse than robbery. By the time they reached Elijah's cabin, the sun was high in the sky, and his worry had grown to a gnawing fear. He practically leaped from Thunder's back and rushed inside, Martha following close behind. Grace lay exactly as he'd left her, but her breathing seemed even more labored. Martha immediately set to work, checking Grace's pulse and temperature with practiced hands. "She's burning up something fierce," Martha muttered, opening her medicine bag. "Help me get some of these layers off her, Ellie. She needs to cool down." Elijah turned his back while Martha loosened Grace's dress and helped her into one of Elijah's clean shirts. When Martha called him back, Grace had been tucked under just a sheet, her auburn hair spread across the pillow like a fan. "I've got stronger herbs than what you keep," Martha said, measuring out powders from small paper packets. "This will bring the fever down, but we need to get fluids in her. And we need to know what happened. This might not just be heat exhaustion. There could be an injury we're missing." Together, they examined Grace more thoroughly, finding bruises on her arms and a nasty gash on the back of her head that had been hidden by her thick hair. Martha cleaned and dressed the wound, her expression grim. "Someone struck her," she said, "hard enough to knock her senseless. It's a wonder she made it as far as she did before collapsing." Elijah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The thought of someone hurting this woman made rage boil in his veins, surprising him with its intensity. He hardly knew Grace, yet he felt protective of her in a way he couldn't explain. "Will she recover?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Martha's shrewd eyes studied his face briefly before she answered. "If we can break this fever in the next day, yes. The wound itself isn't too deep, but combined with exposure and dehydration." She trailed off. "We'll do our best, Illy." For the next several hours, they worked together to bring Grace's fever down. Martha brewed her special tea, and Elijah helped lift Grace's head so she could swallow small sips. They bathed her face, neck, and arms with cool water, and applied cold compresses to her forehead and the back of her neck. By late afternoon, Martha needed to return home to prepare supper for her husband, but she left Elijah with detailed instructions and promised to return the following morning. "Keep giving her the tea every 2 hours," Martha said as she gathered her things, "and the cool compresses whenever her skin feels too hot. If she wakes, try to get her to drink as much water as she can manage." "I will," Elijah promised. "Thank you, Martha." After seeing Martha off, Elijah returned to Grace's bedside. Her cheeks still burned with fever, but her breathing seemed slightly less labored. Taking a seat in the chair he'd pulled up beside the bed, Elijah dipped a cloth in cool water and gently wiped her forehead. "You're going to be just fine," he told her quietly. "Martha Henderson is the best healer in 3 counties. If anyone can get you well again, it's her." To his surprise, Grace's eyelids fluttered open. Those hazel eyes, though still glazed with fever, seemed more focused than before. "You're still here," she whispered. "Of course I am," Elijah replied with a gentle smile. "This is my home." A small frown creased her brow. "Your home?" Her gaze wandered around what she could see of the room. "The stagecoach, I remember now. They stopped us. Men with bandanas over their faces." "Save your strength," Elijah urged, but Grace seemed determined to speak. "They took everything. My trunk, my money. When I tried to keep my mother's locket, one of them hit me." Her hand drifted to the back of her head. "I woke up alone. The coach was gone. Everyone was gone. I started walking, hoping to find help." "You're safe now," Elijah assured her, taking her hand. It felt small and fragile in his larger one. "No one's going to hurt you here." Grace's fingers tightened around his. "Thank you, Illy," she whispered before her eyes drifted closed again. Throughout that second night, Elijah remained vigilant. Every 2 hours, he coaxed Grace awake enough to sip the medicinal tea Martha had left. Between those times, he dozed in the chair, never fully sleeping, always alert to any change in Grace's condition. Around midnight, her fever seemed to spike again. She tossed restlessly, calling out names Elijah didn't recognize: Thomas, Sarah, Papa. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, murmuring reassurances when she grew agitated. "I will care for you," he repeated whenever she seemed most distressed. "You're not alone." By dawn, Elijah was exhausted but determined. Grace's fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't worsened either. He considered that a small victory. After refreshing the water in the basin and brewing a fresh pot of tea, he stepped outside to tend to the animals. The morning air felt refreshing after the close confines of the sickroom. As Elijah fed Thunder and the 2 milk cows, his mind turned to practical matters. He'd need to ride into Spokane Falls soon to inform the sheriff about the stagecoach robbery. Perhaps the sheriff could help identify Grace more fully or contact her family. The thought of Grace leaving once she recovered brought an unexpected pang. Elijah shook his head, bemused by his own reaction. He barely knew the woman, yet already he'd grown accustomed to her presence in his home. There was something about her, a quiet strength even in her weakened state, a gentleness in the way she'd thanked him that drew him to her. "Getting soft in your old age, Winters," he muttered to himself as he milked the cows. At 32, he was hardly old, but 5 years alone on this homestead had aged him in ways that weren't visible to the eye. By the time Martha Henderson returned, Elijah had prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of his molasses. Martha approved of his care during the night and examined Grace thoroughly. "The fever's holding steady," she observed. "Not worse, not better. Let's try something stronger." From her medicine bag, Martha produced a small glass bottle containing a dark liquid. "Willow bark and elderberry tincture with a touch of whiskey," she explained. "More potent than the tea." They administered several drops under Grace's tongue, and Martha showed Elijah how to check for improvement by feeling the pulse at her wrist and throat. "Her heart's still racing too fast," Martha said with a frown. "We need to break this fever today, Illy. Another night like this could weaken her too much." The gravity in Martha's voice sent a chill through Elijah. "What else can we do?" Martha hesitated, then said, "There's one more thing, but it's drastic. We could immerse her in cool water, not cold enough to shock her system, but cool enough to bring her temperature down quickly." "Would that be dangerous?" "It could be, if not done properly," Martha admitted. "But at this point, the fever itself is the greater danger." Elijah nodded grimly. "Then let's prepare." While Martha stayed with Grace, Elijah dragged his largest metal washtub into the main room and began filling it with water from the well. Once it was half full, Martha tested the temperature and had him add a kettle of warm water to take the edge off the well water's chill. Together, they carefully carried Grace, still dressed in Elijah's oversized shirt, to the tub. Her eyes opened briefly as they lowered her into the water, a gasp escaping her cracked lips. "Cold," she whispered, trying weakly to pull away. "I know, honey," Martha soothed, holding her shoulders, "but it will help bring your fever down. Just bear with it a little while." Elijah knelt beside the tub, supporting Grace's head above the water. Her skin felt frighteningly hot against his hands, making the cool water seem necessary rather than cruel. Still, each small shiver that ran through her body made his heart clench. "You're doing fine," he murmured, using his free hand to gently scoop water over her shoulders and the back of her neck. "Just a little longer." After 15 minutes that felt like an eternity, Martha signaled it was time to remove Grace from the bath. They wrapped her in Elijah's cleanest bedsheet and carried her back to the bedroom, where Martha helped change her into a dry shirt while Elijah waited outside. "Now we wait," Martha said when he returned. "If this doesn't break the fever, I don't know what will." The hours that followed were among the longest of Elijah's life. Grace remained unconscious but restless, her breathing shallow. Martha left again in the afternoon, promising to return the following morning unless Elijah sent word sooner. As evening fell, Elijah sat beside Grace, a book open in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over an hour. He was studying her face instead, noting the delicate arch of her eyebrows, the scatter of freckles across her nose that had become more visible as the fever's flush receded slightly. In repose, with her auburn hair spread across the pillow, she looked younger, vulnerable in a way that stirred his protective instincts. "You know," he said quietly, "I never expected company out here. Been on my own so long, I forgot what it's like to care for someone else." He smiled ruefully. "Not that you can hear me rambling." To his shock, Grace's lips curved in a faint smile. "I can hear you," she whispered, her eyes still closed. Elijah straightened, setting the book aside. "Grace, how are you feeling?" Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time since he'd found her, her gaze seemed clear and focused. "Weak," she admitted, "but cooler. The fire inside seems to have dimmed." Elijah pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, relief washing over him at the marked decrease in her temperature. "Your fever's breaking," he confirmed, unable to keep the smile from his face. "Are you thirsty? Hungry?" "Both," she said with a weak laugh that transformed into a cough. Elijah helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back, then brought water and the broth he'd kept simmering on the stove. With each sip she took, his hope grew. The worst seemed to be over. "You stayed up all night," Grace observed as she finished the broth. "Martha told me before she left." "She said you hadn't slept since you found me." Elijah shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Couldn't very well let you suffer alone." Grace's hand found his, her fingers cool for the first time since he'd found her. "You told me you would care for me." "I remember hearing that, even through the fever dreams." "I meant it," Elijah said simply. Her eyes searched his face. "Why, I'm a stranger to you." Elijah considered the question. "My father taught me never to turn away from someone in need," he said finally. "But more than that." He hesitated, then continued honestly. "There was something about you. Even unconscious in the dirt, you had a dignity about you. I couldn't just leave you there." Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Illy. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "No need to think about that," Elijah said firmly. "You're getting better now, that's what matters." Over the next few days, Grace's recovery progressed steadily. Martha Henderson visited daily, pleased with her improvement. By the third day, Grace was able to sit up for longer periods and even took a few tentative steps around the bedroom with Elijah's support. As her strength returned, so did her story. Grace Harlow had been traveling from St. Louis to Spokane Falls to take a position as a schoolteacher. At 26, she had spent the last 5 years teaching in a small school in Missouri, but the death of her father had left her wanting a fresh start. "The school board in Spokane Falls offered me the position based on my references," she explained as Elijah helped her to a chair on the porch for some fresh air. "I was to report to them by July 15th to prepare for the autumn term." Elijah frowned. "Today's the 12th. "You've been ill for nearly a week." Worry creased Grace's brow. "They'll think I've changed my mind if I don't arrive soon, and I have nothing, no clothes except what I was wearing, no teaching materials, not even the letter of appointment." "We'll sort it out," Elijah assured her. "I need to ride into town anyway to report the robbery to Sheriff Tanner. I can explain your situation to the school board." Grace looked up at him gratefully. "You've already done so much for me." "It's no trouble," Elijah said, feeling a strange reluctance at the thought of Grace continuing her journey. In just a few days, he'd grown accustomed to her presence in his home, the sound of her voice, the way sunlight caught in her auburn hair, the intelligence that shone in her eyes as she regained her strength. The next day, Elijah rode to Spokane Falls. The growing settlement, situated where the Spokane River tumbled over a series of waterfalls, had expanded considerably in the 5 years since Elijah had claimed his homestead 30 miles south. What had been little more than a trading post was now a proper town with several streets of businesses, a church, and even a small hotel. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he reported finding Grace and the stagecoach robbery. Sheriff Tanner, a grizzled man in his 40s, nodded grimly as Elijah spoke. "Third robbery this month," Tanner confirmed. "We think it's the Blackwater gang moving north from Idaho territory. They've been hitting stages between here and Montana." He made notes in a ledger as Elijah described Grace's account of the bandits. "Miss Harlow is lucky to be alive. Most of the other passengers from that coach made it to town 2 days ago, but they reported a young woman had been struck and left behind when she resisted. They left her." Elijah couldn't keep the anger from his voice. "Just abandoned her on the trail." Sheriff Tanner looked uncomfortable. "According to the driver, they searched for her but couldn't find her in the darkness. They assumed she'd wandered off or that the bandits had taken her." He shook his head. "Not everyone acts honorably in a crisis, Winters." "Clearly," Elijah muttered. "What about her belongings? Any chance of recovering them?" "We'll try, but honestly, those bandits are likely long gone with whatever they stole." "Is there something specific she needs returned?" "Everything," Elijah said. "She was moving here to teach. All her possessions were in that trunk." Sheriff Tanner's expression softened slightly. "Ah, she must be the new schoolteacher the board's been expecting. They were getting worried." He stood, reaching for his hat. "Let's go speak to Mrs. Patterson. She heads the school board and should know that Miss Harlow has been found." Mrs. Abigail Patterson, a stern-looking woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, listened to Elijah's account with growing concern. "Poor Miss Harlow," she said when he'd finished. "Of course we'll hold her position. The school doesn't open until September, so she has time to recover." She fixed Elijah with a penetrating gaze. "You say she's staying at your homestead, Mr. Winters. Alone with you?" Elijah felt heat rise in his face at the implication. "My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, visits daily. Miss Harlow has been too ill to be moved." Mrs. Patterson's lips thinned. "Be that as it may, propriety must be maintained. Once she's well enough, Miss Harlow should move to town. We have a room reserved for her at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house." "Of course," Elijah agreed, though the thought of Grace leaving brought that same unexpected pang he'd felt before. "I'll bring her to town as soon as she's strong enough to travel." After settling Grace's employment matter, Elijah visited the general store to purchase supplies. In addition to his usual order, he selected fabric, thread, and a simple ready-made dress that he hoped would fit Grace. She couldn't continue wearing his shirts, and her original dress was beyond salvation after her ordeal. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Johnson, raised an eyebrow at his selections. "Buying women's things now, Illy? Something you want to tell us?" Briefly, Elijah explained about finding Grace. Mrs. Johnson immediately softened, helping him choose appropriate items. "Poor dear," she clucked. "Let me add some hair pins and a hairbrush, and she'll need undergarments too." She bustled around the store, adding items to his pile that Elijah would never have thought to purchase. By the time he rode out of Spokane Falls, Thunder was laden with supplies, and Elijah's mind was full of news to share with Grace. He found himself urging the horse to a faster pace, eager to return home. Home. The word had a different feeling now. For 5 years, the cabin had been simply where he lived, a place to sleep, to shelter from the elements, to base his modest ranching operation. Now, with Grace waiting there, it felt like more. "Don't get too attached, Winters," he muttered to himself as Thunder picked his way along the familiar trail. "She'll be heading to town as soon as she's well. When Elijah arrived home, he found Grace sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat. Her face brightened at the sight of him, sending a warm feeling through his chest. "You're looking stronger," he observed as he dismounted. "I feel much better," she assured him. "Martha says the fever is completely gone. Now I just need to regain my strength." Her eyes widened as he began unloading parcels. "What is all this?" "Supplies," Elijah said, suddenly feeling foolish about the dress and other personal items he'd purchased. "And some things for you, Mrs. Johnson at the general store helped me pick them out." Grace's expression softened as he handed her the wrapped packages. "Illy, you shouldn't have spent your money on me. I have nothing to repay you with." "Consider it a loan," Elijah said gruffly. "You can repay me once you're settled and teaching." As Grace opened the packages, exclaiming over each item, Elijah busied himself with the rest of the supplies. When he glanced back, she was holding the simple blue calico dress against herself, tears shining in her eyes. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "Thank you, Illy, for everything." Later, as they sat at Elijah's small table eating the stew he'd prepared, he shared the news from town. Grace was visibly relieved to hear that her position was secure, but her expression fell slightly when he mentioned Mrs. Patterson's insistence that she move to the boarding house as soon as possible. "Of course," she said, toying with her spoon. "That would be proper. She trailed off, looking around the cabin that had been her sanctuary these past days. "Just what?" Elijah prompted gently. Grace's cheeks colored slightly. "I've felt safe here," she admitted. "After what happened on the trail, the thought of being among strangers again is a little frightening." Elijah's heart swelled at her words. "You don't have to leave until you're ready," he assured her. "Mrs. Patterson can wait a few more days." Over the next week, Grace's strength returned steadily. She insisted on helping with light chores around the cabin, saying she couldn't bear to be idle while Elijah worked so hard. He found her to be capable and intelligent company, quick to learn the routines of homestead life and genuinely interested in his modest cattle operation. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch watching the sunset, talking long into the twilight. Grace told him about her childhood in Ohio, her move to Missouri to teach after her mother's death, and her father's passing the previous winter. "I'm alone now," she said one evening, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "No siblings, no parents, just me." "Is that why you came west?" Elijah asked. "To start fresh," Grace nodded. "Partly. And partly because I've always dreamed of adventure. Teaching in Spokane Falls seemed exciting compared to my little school in Missouri. And now, after what happened on the trail," she was quiet for a long moment. "Now I understand that adventure comes with risk," she said finally. "But I'm not sorry I came west, if I hadn't." She glanced at him, then away quickly. "Well, I wouldn't have met you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Elijah felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of hope and caution. He'd been alone for so long, deliberately so after his fiancée had broken their engagement 6 years ago to marry a wealthy businessman in Seattle. The pain of that rejection had driven him to seek isolation, to build a life that depended on no one but himself. Yet here was Grace, slipping past defenses he hadn't even realized were still standing. "I'm glad I found you too," he said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "Even if it was under terrible circumstances." Grace's smile in the fading light made his heart skip. "Sometimes the worst circumstances bring unexpected blessings," she said softly. The next morning, Martha Henderson arrived for her daily visit and pronounced Grace well enough to travel to town. "You've made a remarkable recovery, my dear," she told Grace. "A testament to your strength and to Ellie's care." Grace thanked Martha warmly for all her help. I don't know how I can ever repay either of you, she said, genuine emotion in her voice. Nonsense, Martha said briskly, though her eyes were kind. Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we survive. She turned to Elijah. Will you be taking her to town tomorrow, then? Before Elijah could answer, Grace spoke up. Actually, I was hoping for one more day here, she said. If that's all right with Eli, I'd like to regain a bit more strength before meeting the school board. Of course it's all right, Elijah said quickly, perhaps too quickly judging by the knowing look Martha gave him. After Martha left, Grace and Elijah fell into the comfortable routine they'd established over the past days. She helped him with the garden while he tended the cattle. Then they prepared a simple midday meal together. The domesticity of it felt natural, as if they'd been sharing tasks for years rather than days. That afternoon, Grace asked to see more of the homestead. Elijah happily obliged, helping her onto Thunder's back while he walked alongside, leading the horse around the boundaries of his land. It's beautiful, Grace said as they paused on a rise overlooking a small creek that marked the western edge of the property. You've accomplished so much on your own. Pride warmed Elijah's chest at her words. It's not much compared to the big ranches, but it's mine. Paid for free and clear last year. How many acres? Grace asked, genuinely interested. 160, Elijah replied. Standard homestead claim. I've got 30 head of cattle now, hoping to double that in the next few years. He pointed to the southern edge of his land. Been clearing that section for more crops. Figure I'll plant wheat next spring. Grace's eyes followed his gesture, taking in the half-cleared field. You have plans for the future, she observed. That's good. Something in her tone made Elijah look up at her. She sat straight in the saddle, the summer breeze playing with tendrils of auburn hair that had escaped her simple bun. The blue calico dress he'd purchased fit her well, highlighting the grace of her posture and the returning color in her cheeks. What about you? He asked. What are your plans beyond teaching in Spokane Falls? Grace's gaze remained on the distant horizon. I thought I knew, she said thoughtfully. Teach for a few years, save my money, perhaps open my own small school someday. She glanced down at him with a small smile. But now I'm not so sure. Why's that? Her smile turned wistful. Because plans can change when we least expect them to. Life has a way of presenting us with choices we never anticipated. Elijah felt a tightening in his chest at her words, wondering if she might be referring to the same unspoken thing that had been growing between them these past days. Before he could respond, however, Thunder nickered and shook his head, breaking the moment. We should head back, Elijah said, tugging gently on the reins. Don't want you getting overtired. That evening, their last before Grace would move to town, carried a bittersweet quality. They sat longer than usual on the porch, neither seeming eager to end the day. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. I'll miss this, Grace said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. The quiet, the open space, even the smell of sage on the evening breeze. You could visit, Elijah suggested. It's not so far from town. Grace turned toward him, her face half illuminated by the light spilling from the cabin window. Would you want me to? The directness of her question caught him off guard. Elijah was accustomed to plain-speaking life on the frontier, didn't allow for much pretense, but matters of the heart were different territory altogether. Yes, he said simply, deciding honesty was the only path forward. I would like that very much. Grace's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. Then I will, she promised. The next morning dawned clear and warm. Elijah hitched his wagon while Grace gathered her few belongings, the dress she'd arrived in. Now cleaned and mended, the new clothing he'd purchased, and the personal items Mrs. Johnson had included. As Elijah helped Grace into the wagon, their hands touched briefly, sending that now familiar warmth through his chest. The 2-hour journey to town passed quickly as they talked, both carefully avoiding mention of the separation that awaited them. Spokane Falls welcomed them with the bustle of a growing frontier town. Wagons and riders moved along the main street, and the sounds of construction echoed from where new buildings were being raised near the falls that gave the town its name. Elijah guided the wagon to Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, a neat 2-story building with a small porch and window boxes filled with summer flowers. Mrs. Whitaker herself, a plump woman with a kind face, emerged at the sound of the wagon. "You must be Miss Harlow," she greeted Grace warmly. "Mrs. Patterson sent word to expect you today. We've had your room ready this past week." Grace thanked her, then turned to Elijah as he helped her down from the wagon. For a moment they stood close, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Thank you," Grace said softly, "for saving my life." Elijah shook his head. "You're the one who fought that fever. I just helped a little." "You did far more than that," Grace insisted, her hazel eyes serious. "You showed me kindness when I needed it most. I won't forget that." Before Elijah could respond, Mrs. Patterson appeared from inside the boarding house. "Miss Harlow, we're so relieved to see you recovered. Mr. Winters, thank you for bringing our teacher safely to town." The moment broken, Elijah stepped back, tipping his hat. "Madam." Mrs. Patterson linked her arm through Grace's. "Come along, my dear. There's much to discuss about the school term, and you need to meet the other board members." With a last glance over her shoulder, Grace allowed herself to be led into the boarding house. Elijah stood watching until the door closed behind her, then slowly returned to his wagon. The ride home seemed longer than the journey into town had been. The cabin, when he reached it, felt emptier than it had in years, despite having spent most of his time there alone. Grace's presence, brief as it had been, had somehow filled spaces Elijah hadn't known were vacant. Days passed, then a week. Elijah threw himself into work around the homestead, rising earlier and working later than usual. Martha Henderson, who visited occasionally, watched him with knowing eyes but said nothing about his obvious melancholy. 10 days after bringing Grace to town, Elijah was repairing a section of fence when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, he was surprised to see Sheriff Tanner riding toward him. "Afternoon, Winters," Tanner called as he drew his horse to a halt. "Got some news for you." Elijah straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "About the stagecoach robbers. Caught 3 of them trying to sell stolen goods in Coeur d'Alene," Tanner confirmed. "Found some items that might belong to your Miss Harlow. Thought you might want to bring her by the office to identify them." A thrill ran through Elijah at both the news and the excuse to see Grace again. "I'll ride in tomorrow," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Tanner nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Figured you'd want to deliver the news personally." The following day, Elijah made the journey to Spokane Falls, taking more care than usual with his appearance before leaving. He found Grace at the schoolhouse, a simple wooden building near the center of town. She was standing on a ladder, hanging a map on the wall when he entered. "Ellie," she exclaimed, her face lighting with genuine pleasure at the sight of him. She descended the ladder quickly, smoothing her skirts as she approached. "What brings you to town?" Elijah explained about the captured bandits and the recovered items. As he spoke, he couldn't help noticing how well Grace looked. The last traces of her illness were gone, replaced by healthy color in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that had nothing to do with fever. "That's wonderful news," Grace said when he'd finished. "I never expected to see any of my things again." She glanced around the schoolroom. I've just been setting up for the term. Mrs. Patterson advanced me some of my salary to purchase basic supplies. The school looks nice, Elijah said, taking in the rows of simple desks and the blackboard at the front of the room. It will be, Grace agreed. We're expecting 15 students to start, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Her enthusiasm was evident in her voice. Let me just finish here, and we can go to the sheriff's office. As Elijah helped Grace secure the map on the wall, their hands brushed several times, each contact sending that now familiar warmth through him. They worked together smoothly, anticipating each other's movements in a way that spoke of the bond formed during her convalescence. At the sheriff's office, they found Tanner sorting through items recovered from the bandits. Among them was a small silver locket on a delicate chain, the very item Grace had mentioned trying to protect when she was struck. "My mother's locket," she breathed, taking it reverently from Tanner's outstretched hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it to reveal tiny portraits inside. "My parents," she explained to Elijah, showing him the small paintings. "It's the only thing I have left of them." Several other items had also been recovered: a few books, a small wooden box containing hair combs that had belonged to Grace's mother, and remarkably, the letter of appointment from the Spokane Falls School Board that had been in her reticule. "The trunk with your clothing and other possessions is still missing," Tanner told her apologetically. "These men claim their partners took it, and they've fled south into Oregon Territory." "These things are enough," Grace said gratefully, gathering the recovered items. "More than I hoped for." After thanking the sheriff, Elijah and Grace stepped out onto the boardwalk. The afternoon sun was warm, glinting off the silver locket now fastened around Grace's neck. "Would you have time for a cup of coffee?" Grace asked, looking up at Elijah with those expressive hazel eyes. "Mrs. Whitaker serves the best apple pie in town on Thursdays." Elijah's heart lifted at the invitation. "I'd like that." Over coffee and generous slices of pie at the boarding house's dining room, they caught up on the events of the past 10 days. Grace spoke animatedly about her preparations for the school term while Elijah shared news of the homestead. "Martha asked after you yesterday," he said, watching Grace's face. "She says you should come for Sunday dinner sometime." Grace's eyes brightened. "I'd love that. I've missed her and your cabin, and—" She hesitated, then added softly, "and you, Illy. I've missed you." The simple admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Elijah felt something shift in his chest, as if a weight he'd been carrying had suddenly lifted. "I've missed you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I expected to." Grace's cheeks colored slightly, but she held his gaze. "What does that mean, Illy?" It was a direct question, the kind that couldn't be answered with anything but truth. Elijah took a deep breath, aware they were in a public place but unwilling to let the moment pass. "It means I care for you, Grace. These past weeks without you have shown me just how much." Grace's expression softened. "I feel the same," she admitted. "From the moment I woke in your cabin and heard you promise to care for me, something changed. I've never met a man like you, someone who gives so freely without expectation of return." "It wasn't entirely selfless," Elijah confessed with a small smile. "I've enjoyed your company more than I can say." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Whitaker arriving to clear their plates, but the connection between them remained, stronger than before. As afternoon faded toward evening, Elijah reluctantly acknowledged he needed to start the journey home. "Will you come to Sunday dinner at the Hendersons?" he asked as they stood on the boarding house porch. "I could ride in and escort you." "I'd like that very much," Grace replied. On impulse, Elijah reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Until Sunday, then." The days until Sunday seemed to crawl by. Elijah found himself counting the hours, something he hadn't done since boyhood, anticipating Christmas morning. When Sunday finally arrived, he rose before dawn, completed his chores in record time, and was on the trail to town by mid-morning. Grace was ready when he arrived at the boarding house, wearing the blue calico dress he'd bought her, and with her auburn hair arranged simply but becomingly. The sight of her waiting on the porch, her face lighting up at his approach, filled Elijah with a happiness he hadn't felt in years. The ride to the Hendersons' homestead was pleasant, with Grace seated securely in front of Elijah on Thunder's back. The closeness was necessary but not unwelcome, her back warm against his chest as they talked easily about the passing landscape. Martha and Robert Henderson welcomed them warmly, Martha embracing Grace like a long-lost daughter. "Look at you," she exclaimed, holding Grace at arm's length. "The picture of health. I'd never know you were at death's door just weeks ago." "Thanks to you and Ellie," Grace said, returning the older woman's embrace. "I owe you both my life." Sunday dinner was a joyous affair. Robert Henderson, a quiet man with a dry wit, drew Grace into conversation about her teaching plans, while Martha served a feast of roast chicken, fresh vegetables from her garden, and her famous berry cobbler for dessert. Throughout the meal, Elijah found his gaze continually drawn to Grace. The easy way she fit into the gathering, her genuine interest in the Hendersons' lives, and the warmth of her laughter all confirmed what he already knew. His feelings for her went far beyond simple attraction or concern for her welfare. After dinner, while Robert showed Grace his prized apple orchard, Martha cornered Elijah in the kitchen. "You're in love with her," she stated matter-of-factly as she handed him a plate to dry. Elijah nearly dropped the plate. "Martha, don't bother denying it, Ellie Winters. I've known you 5 years, and I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at Grace Harlow." She fixed him with her shrewd gaze. "The question is, what do you intend to do about it?" "She's just starting her life here," Elijah said, carefully placing the dried plate on the stack. "She has her teaching position, plans of her own," Martha snorted. "And that stops you from courting her properly because—" "I don't want her to feel obligated," Elijah admitted after a moment. "She's grateful to me for finding her, caring for her. That's not the same as love." Martha interrupted. "Illy, that girl looks at you the same way you look at her. That's not gratitude I see in her eyes." Before Elijah could respond, Grace and Robert returned from the orchard, Grace's arms filled with early apples and her cheeks flushed from the late afternoon sun. The sight of her, laughing at something Robert had said, struck Elijah with the force of revelation. Martha was right. He loved Grace Harlow. The realization, once acknowledged, seemed so obvious he wondered how he hadn't named it sooner. The journey back to town as evening approached was quieter than the morning ride had been, a comfortable silence between them as the landscape turned golden in the setting sun. When they reached the boarding house, Elijah dismounted first, then helped Grace down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Grace said, looking up at him with those expressive hazel eyes. "It was wonderful to see Martha and Robert again." "They enjoyed seeing you," Elijah replied. "Martha says you're welcome anytime." Grace smiled. "And you? Am I welcome to visit you as well?" The direct question, so characteristic of her forthright nature, deserved an equally direct answer. "Always," Elijah said. "My door is always open to you, Grace." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes. "I start teaching next week," she said, "but I'm free on Saturdays. Perhaps I could ride out then." "I'd like that," Elijah said, his heart lifting at the thought. "I could meet you halfway, make the journey easier." "That would be nice," Grace agreed. She hesitated, then added, "Illy, these past weeks since you found me, They've changed something in me. I want you to know that." Elijah stepped closer, drawn by the earnestness in her voice. "Changed how?" "I came west looking for a new start, thinking teaching would be enough," Grace said, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. "But now I find myself wanting more than I expected to." The implication in her words gave Elijah courage. "Grace," he began, taking her hand in his. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but I know what I feel when I'm with you and what I feel when we're apart. If you'd allow it, I'd like to court you properly." Grace's face illuminated with a smile that outshone the rising moon. "I'd like that very much, Illy." On impulse, Elijah raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her fingers. "Until Saturday, then." The school term began the following week, keeping Grace busy with her new students. True to her word, she rode out to Elijah's homestead that Saturday and each Saturday thereafter. As summer faded into autumn, their courtship blossomed like the late wildflowers that dotted the prairie. Elijah found excuses to visit town more frequently, sometimes attending community gatherings where Grace was present, other times simply stopping by the schoolhouse to walk her to the boarding house. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing them together, and even Mrs. Patterson's initial concerns about propriety faded as the sincerity of their attachment became apparent. By late October, when the first frost silvered the grass around Elijah's cabin, he knew with certainty that he wanted to spend his life with Grace. The question was no longer if he would ask her to marry him, but when and how. The opportunity presented itself on a crisp November Saturday. Grace had ridden out to the homestead as usual, and they were walking along the creek that marked the western boundary of Elijah's land. The cottonwoods had shed their leaves, which crunched pleasantly underfoot, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling landscape. "I've been thinking about next year's planting," Elijah said as they paused to watch a hawk circling overhead. "Thinking I might expand the garden, maybe add some fruit trees like Robert has." Grace smiled up at him. "Planning for the future is good. Thing is," Elijah continued, gathering his courage, "I've been thinking about more than just crops and trees." He turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about family, about sharing this land, this life with someone." Grace's eyes widened slightly, her breath visibly catching. "Have you now?" "I have," Elijah confirmed, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Harlow, these past months have been the happiest of my life. When I found you on that trail, I had no idea you'd find your way into my heart as well." He swallowed hard, then continued. "I love you, Grace. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Oh, Illy," she whispered. "Yes. Yes, I'll have you. I love you too so much." Elijah pulled her into his arms then, his heart soaring as he lowered his lips to hers for their first kiss. It was sweet and tender, a promise of the life they would build together. They were married on Christmas Day in the small church in Spokane Falls, with Martha and Robert Henderson standing as witnesses. Grace wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Johnson had helped her select, with her mother's locket gleaming at her throat. Elijah, in his best suit, could scarcely believe his good fortune as he watched his bride walk toward him down the short aisle. "I will care for you always," he whispered as they exchanged vows, echoing the promise he'd made during those long nights of her fever. "And I for you," Grace replied, her voice steady and sure. Winter passed in a haze of newlywed joy as they settled into life together at the homestead. Grace continued teaching, riding into town each morning and returning each afternoon, while Elijah expanded his cattle operation and prepared for spring planting. The cabin, once merely a place to sleep, became a true home under Grace's influence, warm, welcoming, and filled with the books she loved. Spring brought new calves to the small herd and fresh growth to the expanded garden. By summer, as the first anniversary of their meeting approached, Grace had news of her own to share. "Illy," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, her hand resting lightly on her still flat stomach. "I visited Martha today while you were in town." Something in her tone made Elijah turn to look at her. "Everything all right?" Grace's smile was radiant in the golden light. "More than all right. Martha confirmed what I've suspected for a few weeks now. We're going to have a baby, Illy, in late January." Joy unlike anything Elijah had ever known washed over him. He gathered Grace into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which to him she was. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "The beginning of our family," Grace agreed, nestling against him. "Our future." As night fell around them, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky, Elijah marveled at how much his life had changed in a single year. From solitary rancher to husband and soon-to-be father, all because he'd found a sick woman on the trail and promised to care for her. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, noticing his contemplative silence. "About how different things might have been if I'd taken another trail that day," Elijah admitted. "If I hadn't found you." Grace turned in his arms, her hand coming up to touch his face. "But you did find me," she said softly. "And you stayed up all night and said you would care for me. That moment changed everything." "For both of us," Elijah agreed, covering her hand with his own. "For all three of us now," Grace corrected with a smile, her free hand resting protectively over where their child grew. The years that followed brought all the joys and challenges of family life. Their son, Thomas Robert Winters, was born on a snowy January night with Martha Henderson serving as midwife. 2 years later, he was joined by a sister, Sarah Elizabeth. The homestead prospered, the cattle herd grew, and the cleared land yielded abundant harvests. Grace continued teaching until Sarah's birth, then dedicated herself to their growing family and the homestead. Her natural intelligence and organizational skills proved as valuable in managing their expanding operations as they had in the schoolroom. Together, she and Elijah built something neither could have created alone: a thriving ranch and a loving home. On the 10th anniversary of the day Elijah had found Grace, they hosted a celebration at their now expanded home. The Hendersons were there, Martha's hair now completely silver but her spirit undimmed. Sheriff Tanner, recently retired, attended with his wife. Even Mrs. Patterson came, still prim but softened by a decade of watching the community grow and flourish. As twilight fell and their guests departed, Elijah and Grace stood on the porch, watching 8-year-old Thomas and 6-year-old Sarah chasing fireflies in the yard. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "That day when you found me half dead on the trail, did you ever think we'd be here like this?" Elijah's arm tightened around her waist. "I couldn't have imagined it," he admitted. "But looking back, I think my heart knew something my head didn't. From that first moment, from that first promise to care for you, something changed. You saved my life," Grace said softly. "And then you filled it with more love and happiness than I ever dreamed possible." "We saved each other," Elijah corrected, turning to face her. At 42, there was silver threading through his dark hair, and the Montana sun had etched fine lines around his eyes. But when he looked at Grace, he still saw the woman who had captured his heart that long-ago summer. "I was just existing before you. You taught me how to truly live." Grace's smile, as bright and beautiful as it had been on their wedding day, warmed him from within. "We've built a good life, haven't we? The best life," Elijah agreed, drawing her close for a kiss as their children's laughter filled the gathering darkness. And we're just getting started. As stars appeared above the Montana prairie, Elijah Winters held his wife in his arms and gave thanks for fever, fate, and the promise made long ago that had changed everything. I will care.